All right. As promised, and this is, and I want to say this from the very beginning. So what I'm providing here, this is not legal advice, okay? Legal advice requires attorneys, legal experts to be able to understand the particular details and nuances of individualized factual circumstances. What I am going to do during this program is to provide a generalized overview of information that can help, in hopes to help those who are looking for this type of information, to point them toward the direction where they need to go. As always, with any particular instance, you will need to seek legal advice in your community. Also, and I alluded to this earlier, because this is a huge country, we have the national government, but we also have 50 separate individual sources of legal authority that governs your states. And then you have additional municipal and other sources of legal authority that apply. You would have to consult legal experts in your community to see how all of those various layers and levels of laws may impact your specific circumstance. All right. Having said that, what I'm going to do now is to respond to, hopefully, to the many questions I've received from people asking me, Abe, my employer is telling me I got to get the shot. I don't want it. What can I do? This program is not meant to say, listen, this is a free country. If you want to get the shot, you are entitled to be able to do so. This is not in any way to castigate anybody who wants to do it. This is for those who have been asking me, what can I do if I don't want to do it? All right. So here we go. The first thing I want to say, and I'm going to read, this is going to be a little more legalese than usual, but I'm going to do my best, as I always do, to try to translate from legalese to American. The first thing that everybody needs to understand is that we have this thing called the United States Constitution and a Bill of Rights. Okay. In addition to that, we have statutory protections, and I'm going to begin my comments now applying or appealing to those who would like to avail themselves of a religious accommodation, that they have concerns about getting the injection, getting the shot, and they have a desire to assert their religious liberty as a means of aiding them in maintaining their consciences intact. Okay. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as amended by the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, prohibits many private employers and government employers from discriminating against their employees on the basis of a host of categories, including among them religion. All right? Religion. Now, you heard me say that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, this is federal legislation, national legislation. It applies to many private employers and government employers, okay? It applies to all federal government employers as well as all private employers that have 15 or more employees in their businesses. All right? Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and which was amended by the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, prohibits discrimination against their employees on the basis of a host of other areas, but including religion. I'm going to read from the law. This is what the law states, quote, it shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, or to limit, segregate, or classify his employees or applicants for employment in any way which would deprive or tend to deprive any individual or of employment opportunities or otherwise adversely affect his status as an employee on the basis of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. That is 42 U.S. Code, Section 2000E-2A. All right. Now, as I said, Title VII's anti-discrimination provisions apply to any employer. Any. This is private or public. This is private or governmental. Okay. Any employer who employs 15 or more employees for at least 20 weeks within a given year. The term employer as used in Title VII is quite broad, but it does not include independent contractors and perhaps those who are clearly not employees as you understand that term in the work environment. Now, that is the federal bases for anti-discrimination laws. Most states have a mini version of Title VII in their state law that would apply to employers who have less than 15 employers. This is why I'm saying there are variations among different states. So depending on where you are, your state may have additional protections for individuals who are employed by employers that have less than 15 employees. All right. Now let me keep going because I want to explain this. Title VII, well, I'll say this just to make it clear. Title VII applies to private employers, but it also applies to government employers, whether state and local or federal. Government employees may also have constitutional protections through the Free Exercise Clause of the U.S. Constitution that employees of private employers would not have. Okay? Government employers, you have additional protections constitutionally. Government employees, I mean. All right? These constitutional protections, of course, would be separate from and in addition to protections that Title VII affords. All right, I see a question. Jerry, I'm telling you I'm going to get to your question in a few minutes. I'm doing this slowly because it's a lot to unpack. I'm pretty sure we're not going to get to questions today, to calls today. All right, so let's keep going. Title VII provides that an employer must accommodate an employee's religious observance or practice unless the employer demonstrates that the employer is unable to reasonably accommodate the employee without imposing, here's the technical terminology, an undue hardship on the conduct of the business. Now, this undue hardship must be demonstrable. It can't be speculative. It can't be hypothetical. It must be demonstrable. All right. The U.S. Supreme Court has stated, quote, the intent and effect of this definition was to make it an unlawful employment practice for an employee, an unlawful employment practice for an employer not to make reasonable accommodations short of undue hardship for the religious practices of his employees and prospective employees. This is from the Transworld Airlines Inc. versus Hardison case from 1977. Therefore, an employee protected under the terms of Title VII facing an employer-imposed COVID-19 vaccination mandate and who has a sincerely held religious belief that would prohibit the employee from being vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine is entitled, hear me, entitled to request a Title VII religious accommodation from the employer. Entitled to do so. All right. The Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, the EEOC, is the federal agency tasked with enforcing anti-discrimination provisions in Title VII. Now, I'm going to skip to something because the question was raised. So I'm going to skip to this. I plan to get to it later. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get to it. But I'm going to explain this. The question was presented, well, what would be a religious objection to receiving COVID shots? Okay. I cannot give you your religious objection. That's individual. However, I know some people would like to know, all right, that according to the research, all right, the Johnson & Johnson COVID shot used abortion-derived fetal cell lines in its manufacture, all right? So in its manufacturing process, the Johnson & Johnson shot, and this is based on their own published information, they've used abortion-derived fetal cell lines in its manufacture. Now, Johnson & Johnson is one. That's a separate source of the shot. Moderna and Pfizer did not use abortion-derived fetal cell lines to manufacture their shots. However, they did evidently use abortion-derived fetal lines to test the efficacy of their vaccines. So Johnson & Johnson used it to manufacture. Moderna and Pfizer use it to test. All right. Regardless of its manufacture or using it for testing, if someone had a sincerely held religious belief against taking any shot that used abortion-derived fetal cell lines in either their manufacture or their testing, such could appear to be a defensible religious objection to any of the three available COVID-19 shots. Okay? Now, using it to produce or manufacture is one. Johnson & Johnson did that. Moderna and Pfizer used abortion-derived cell lines to test the efficacy of the drugs. People have different opinions about that. I'm just using that as an example of what I'm talking about. Man, this clock is extra disrespectful today. Getting back to what I was saying about the EEOC. All right. According to the EEOC, now remember, this is the federal agency that's responsible for enforcing the anti-discrimination protections provided for us by law in the employment context. According to the EEOC, if an employer accommodates an objecting employee by exempting the objecting employee from an employer-imposed vaccination mandate, reasonable accommodations that would not impose an undue hardship on the employer may include, y'all listen up to this, listen up here, reasonable accommodations may include requiring the unvaccinated employee entering the workplace to wear a face mask, for example, or work at a physical distance, or to work a modified shift, or get periodic tests for COVID-19, or be given the opportunity to work remotely via telework, or to accept a reassignment. All of this comes directly from the EEOC's own guidance. All right, now you need to be aware of this, because I know there's some people who would say, I don't want to get the shot and I ain't wearing a mask. I'm not doing this. You need to be aware. And I'm just talking about legally. I'm not talking about my opinion about these things. I want you to be aware legally of what this could mean. If you attempt to avail yourself of a religious accommodation, be aware that the employer could say, sure, we'll accommodate your religious request for accommodation, but we will require you to work here, or would you consider this reassignment, or you may have to wear these masks, or you may have to do these other things. Under the prevailing understanding of the law, those could be viable accommodations. If you were to attempt to secure religious accommodation and then reject the accommodation, you could be undermining your request for an accommodation in the first place. You need to be aware of that. All right. As I stated, the EEOC guidance, in which it specifically opines that masking, physical distancing, and periodic testing are within the parameters of reasonable accommodations for unvaccinated employees. If you reject those, it may undermine the claims of an employee who objects not only to the shot, but also to alternative measures such as masking and testing. Now, I'm just explaining so you understand these things. I'm not saying that I endorse that. I'm letting you know the legal parameters there. All right, let me keep going. I got a lot to get to. Goodness gracious. All right. Now, here's something that everybody needs to understand. Get this clear. Title VII defines the term religion broadly. All right. But it is of the utmost importance to realize that in the COVID vaccination context in particular, any objection or request for religious accommodation must be religious. All right. This point cannot be overemphasized. It must be a religious objection. In many cases, people objecting to the shots and to COVID vaccines in particular may have reasons other than religious reasons for objecting. For example, non-religious reasons could include the vaccines are experimental, They weren't sufficiently tested before being approved. There's insufficient time elapsed to determine the long-term effects. And there are a host of others that I'm going to get to when this disrespectful music goes off on the other side of the break. But you need to understand that medical or health concerns are not synonymous, legally speaking, with a religious objection.
In His image, delighting in God's plan for gender and sexuality.
I loved it. I loved how biblically sound it was, all the scripture to back it up.
The testimonies were very powerful.
If it's a prodigal child that has just run away or one that's caught up in same-sex attraction, there's hope in Jesus.
In His Image is now available on DVD and can be purchased in bulk to pass out to friends and family. Order today by visiting afastore.net.
Are you in need of hope, encouragement, and the love of God? I'm Pastor Salem. I'd like to invite you to join us for the Christian Worship Hour. For decades, I've been teaching the Word of God so that people everywhere can experience the love and power of a personal relationship with our Lord. Tune into this station this weekend and prepare to be blessed and encouraged by another life-changing message.
Learn more about our program at ChristianWorshipHour.com.
Missions and Church Planting. This is David Wheaton, host of The Christian Worldview. With all the transformative events taking place, the issue of missions and church planting may seem a bit irrelevant until we recall the parting words of Christ. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. This is a command from the Son of God, one that is much more important than the geopolitical news flashing across our screens. The world is not going to be saved, but God is still saving souls. Let's be about the King's mission. Hear the contrast between biblical and unbiblical missions at thechristianworldview.org, and then tune in this weekend for another topic that will sharpen your worldview.
Listen to The Christian Worldview with David Wheaton, Saturday mornings at 8 Central on American Family Radio.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd Starnes. Stand by for news and commentary next.
My goal as a teacher is to impart knowledge and then be able then for them to take it and turn it into wisdom. As we teach, I think, okay, 5 years down the road, how will the material that I am teaching them really affect their lives and their careers?
Hi, Todd Starnes here. Truett offers biblically centered degree programs. Check out truett.edu/Starnes. The Fighting Irish are fighting claims that Notre Dame's mascot is offensive. The leprechaun mascot has been around for decades, but a survey conducted by Quality Logo Products found the leprechaun to be the fourth most offensive mascot in the country. The most offensive happened to be Florida State's mascot. Notre Dame is defending their beloved mascot, saying it's a celebration of Irish heritage, a heritage that is regarded with respect and loyalty. They also took great umbrage with the notion the Fighting Irish nickname is akin to the Washington Redskins. ESPN's Max Kellerman says many Irish Americans are offended by the leprechaun, as well as the Fighting Irish nickname. He says negative stereotypes of marginalized people are offensive. Well, this may very well be one of the most ridiculous cancel culture stories I've come across, but I doubt Notre Dame is going to surrender. They're not called the Fighting Irish for nothing. I'm Todd Starnes.
The Hamilton Quarter podcast and one-minute commentaries are available at afr.net. Back to the Hamilton Quarter on American Family Radio.
Welcome back, Abraham Hamilton III. I'm going to try to get in as much as I can today. And look, I'm just going to tell y'all, it ain't going to happen. So I'm going to carry some of this over to tomorrow, Lord willing. And I may even have to pick some of it up on Monday. And, man, look at that, Tuesday. Thank you, Mr. Rosa. I didn't get to roll your name earlier today. Goodness gracious. All right, let's keep going. So, remember, any request for religious accommodation must be religious. Now, let me say something. I'll pause this line of discussion because the main focus for today is to aid those who would seek to assert a religious accommodation that would allow them to avoid employer mandates for the shots. There are other laws that could and again, this varies from state to state, there are other laws that could allow for mental or health-based pursuits or requests for accommodation. One of the major sources would be the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay? Don't assume that the law only applies to those who have some sort of overt, obvious physical disability. There is grounds there are bases there that could allow for non-religious accommodation requests. Okay? You need to be aware of that. But again, you have to consult your local laws, your local state laws, and also many of your employers, even those who are making these shots mandatory, their own policies allow for religious accommodation and or health-based accommodations. You simply have to ask for the various forms that they have to file them. All right, let me keep going. So much to... All right. So your accommodation request for religious accommodation must be religious. The fact that or that you believe that these shots are experimental, not sufficiently tested before being approved and distributed under the emergency use authorization statute. If you have concerns that there have been cases where vaccine recipients have experienced undesirable side effects, even death, insufficient evidence to exist to demonstrate that the vaccines are in fact medically effective in immunizing the recipient, things like that are non-religious based concerns. Viable the concerns may be, but you have to understand that they are not religious. And not to even mention, I have here this study in my hand from Israel. Let me get it. Yes, from the Maccabi Healthcare and Tel Aviv University. That their study that they just released last week indicates that natural immunity actually is more potent in resisting against recent variants and other sources of COVID-19 than the actual vaccination. Now, to be clear and fair, this study only deals with the Pfizer shots. But it's exponentially, according to this study from Maccabi Healthcare and Tel Aviv University, exponentially more potent is those who have had COVID. They remain unvaccinated, and the antibody sources that are generated naturally are more potent. Now, again, that's one study, but things like that are things like that are legitimate concerns, but they would not necessarily qualify as religious concerns for accommodation. All right. And I keep using that terminology, accommodation, because that is the terminology that the federal law uses. All right. Let's keep going. It is clear based on the law that an objector who has a religious objection to all vaccinations, not just COVID-19 vaccinations, would present a case with a higher probability of success for securing a religious vaccination, a religious accommodation, because it's clear that this wasn't something, I ain't new to this, I'm true to this. This ain't something that just didn't come up because of COVID. This is something that I've maintained for a long period of time. You have a clear cut case, most likely, to secure a religious accommodation that would allow you to be exempted from employer mandates. All right. It's pretty clear why that's the case. Objectors who object only to COVID-19 vaccinations but receive other vaccinations. Let me make sure I get it. Take other types of medications and seek other types of medical interventions. They could open themselves up to being accused that their objections to COVID-19 are not sincerely religious unless they could articulate religious reasons why they object to COVID-19 shots in particular, but not any other sources. You need to be aware, even though I shared the information with you before about Johnson & Johnson shots, they used abortion-derived fetal tissue in the manufacture of their shots. Moderna and Pfizer did not use it in the manufacture, but they did use them in testing the efficacy of their shots. You need to be aware, okay, that there are other shots, vaccinations that have used fetal tissue lines, either in manufacture or in testing or both. They include shots and vaccinations for things like against the chicken pox. All right. The MMR vaccination, rubella, hepatitis A, rabies, and shingles, just to name a few. Now, I want to explain something. Just because those different shots use the aborted fetal tissue in the various ways that they may have used them, and you may have taken those shots, but you want to use the abortion-derived fetal tissue as a basis to anchor your religious accommodation requests in light of the COVID vaccine shots. All right. It is very possible that some of you may not have known that those other shots use those things. So just because you have gotten those other shots, do not undermine your ability to claim a religious accommodation based on that knowledge in this instance. Okay, I want to let you know that, because there's some people that are saying, oh, well, if you took those and you can't use this now. The facts are that many people, if not most people, had no idea that those things were in them, and that's how they use them. Okay, so I want you to know that that doesn't automatically disqualify you from seeking a religious accommodation. All right. And I just want to give you the specific case site to support this. The fact that a religious belief was only recently acquired does not render that belief an insincere one, because the legal test that's going to be applied is the sincerity of the belief, not the validity of it. Our Constitution does not allow employers to stand as the ultimate arbiter of what religious belief is sincere and what is not. All right, and let me say this now as well. Your employer cannot require you to get some type of letter from your pastor or from some clergyman or for some denomination to support your religious beliefs, because religious beliefs in America are individual. They're not collective. So even if your denomination doesn't share your sincerely held religious belief, that doesn't mean that your religious belief isn't sincere. All right. Now, there are circumstances where having letters and support from clergy things can help, but it has to be specific. All right. It cannot be a general, I support my parishioners' rights to conscience. It has to be something specific that would support your religious accommodation claim. Otherwise, that letter could work against what you're seeking to accomplish. All right. I just want to say that. Let me try to keep going. Man, I got so much to get to. It is actually inappropriate. All right. See, there's a question. I heard your pastor will have to sign the religious beliefs. That is not true. Your request for a religious accommodation does not have to include a signing off by your pastor. It does not. Religious beliefs are individual. Now, as I said, if your pastor or your clergy member or your denomination provides letters in support of your religious accommodation claims that are specific to your religious accommodation claims, it could help. But there's some instances where you have some congregations, some churches, some pastors who don't want to get involved in it and won't offer the letter. That is not required. There's nothing in the law that requires that. If your employer requires it, you need to lovingly and respectfully let them know that that is beyond the scope of the law. Now, here's something that I want to make sure I share as well. If you pursue a religious accommodation in light of an employer's mandate, you have to submit that accommodation request in writing. All right? Religious accommodation requests should always be in writing. To whom the request should be submitted will depend upon the particular nature and organizational structure of your employer. In all cases, though, the employee should keep a copy of your religious accommodation request and have the person at the employer's place of business to whom the request is submitted sign a receipt for the request, noting both the date and time the request is submitted as proof that the request was submitted and that the employer received it. All right? Everybody got me? You got to get it in writing. Keep a copy for yourself. Make sure that your employer, whoever receives it at your employer, provides signs for it, the date and the time, because you need to be able to document when your religious accommodation request was submitted. All right. Oh man, look at this clock. This is terrible. This is terrible. Remember what I said also about your religious accommodation request being individual. Okay, it is your request if you are making them. It is not your churches. It is not your denominations. It is not your parishes. It is an individualized request. I said this earlier, but I want to give you the site for this. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, does not require that an employee's religious beliefs coincides with the tenets of any church or religious denomination. This comes from Heller versus EBB Auto Company. All right. For this reason, an employer has no legal basis to require an employee to support the employee's asserted religious belief with the statement of any other person or organization, including the employee's clergy. An employer may not question the validity of an employee's religious beliefs. By their nature, religious beliefs are matters of personal faith and oftentimes not subject to objective proof of them. To say it more simply, your employer can't require you to validate, prove to me your belief is valid. No, that's not the place of an employer. The only question is it sincere? All right, sincerity, not validity. Usually, an employer must demonstrate that it has attempted to accommodate an employee's religious beliefs before claiming it cannot do so without imposing undue hardship on the employer. This is Redmond versus GAF Corp. that requires this. This is a 1978 case. All right. I mentioned that it's a 1978 case because none of this law is new. None of this law just happened to wake up because COVID has come around. All right. This has been around. In addition to what I just said, the employer, hear me well, the employer has the burden of demonstrating any undue hardship. If they're going to say they can't do it, they have to prove why they can't do it. All right. And evidence of undue hardship must be more than hypothetical and speculative. This standard was pronounced in Smith versus Pyro Mining Company. This is in 1987. Now, I'm sharing all of this with you so that you can be armed. We're coming to the end of this program, but we need to understand that every single American citizen, you have rights of conscience and you have religious freedom rights. Almost every state in the union, in its state law, has a formula or prescriptions to allow for religious accommodation as an exemption basis from employer mandated injections. All right. What I'm describing generally, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employers, both private and public, for both private and government employers, from discriminating against employees' sincerely held religious beliefs. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies to public employers and private employers that have 15 or more employees. It applies to all national government, federal employers, and private employers that have 15 or more employees. Most states have a mini Title VII that governs employers that have less than 15 employees. You do not have to throw your hands up in the air and say there's nothing I can do. If many of you, the beginning of this process can start when you inform your employer you would like to avail yourself of your religious accommodation. And remember, the accommodation request has to be specifically and particularly religious and not generalized health concerns. We'll have more on this tomorrow, Lord willing, on the Hamilton Corner. I wanted to get to some additional information that I wasn't able to get to yesterday because I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance and the availability of protections for religious objections to the shots that are not limited in federal law. I said yesterday that Title Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination by employers, that is private employers and government employers, on the basis of religion. Title VII of the Federal Rights Act of 1964 applies to employers that have 15 or more employees. I mentioned yesterday, states, however, may have a state version or a mini Title VII that would apply to employers, both private and governmental, that have less than 15 employees. And so you definitely want to seek that out. Another source of legal protections would flow from the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. RFRA is how it's described colloquially. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the federal law, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton, by the way, protects American citizens from discrimination on the basis of religion. Just as that there is a federal law, most states in the country also have statutory exemptions like RFRA. The vast majority, in fact, of states have statutes that specifically grant religious exemptions from mandatory school vaccination programs. I'm mentioning that because among the questions I received, I got lots of inquiries from parents who have children in schools and even parents of children that are going to college. Many of them are going to public schools, even some private schools. Now, I will tell you that you have a greater opportunity to assert a religious accommodation request through government schools because of the First Amendment than you do even in some private schools. But even most private schools in the country will have religious accommodation requests if you simply at religious accommodation forms, if you simply ask for them. So I am saying if you are interested in this, you want to pursue this, you need to make that request. Now, getting back to what I said, the vast majority of states have statutes that specifically grant religious exemptions from mandatory school vaccination programs. For that reason, you should always check the statutes in your state in which the potentially objecting student is attending school to determine whether or not the state provides statutory religious exemption protections. Now, as I said yesterday, I am just sharing information. I'm not offering anybody individualized legal advice because I don't know what your situation is. In order to get legal advice, you would have to have an attorney that knows your particular circumstance, your municipality, your locale, the laws in your state, your particular specific objection, religious objection that you want to raise as a basis to pursue religious accommodation. But I'm sharing this to kind of give you some basic information that could help point you in the right direction. Now, in addition to this, there are a couple other categories where, man, this clock is extra disrespectful. Come on, Abraham, hurry up. A couple other categories I wanted to get to, and I want to make sure that we get to. Give me a second. Got that. I wanted to address the military. Okay. The reality is the Department of Defense may issue or has in some instances issued orders requiring service members to get COVID shots. All right. Service members, however, still have the right to challenge unlawful orders. All right. The Nuremberg laws give us a legal source for that and other laws. Whether an order to receive the COVID shot is lawful remains an open question, though. All right. It remains an open question. I anticipate that this will ultimately be litigated through some form of court martial at some point. Now, let me say something. I am not a military law expert. All right. I'm just sharing information based on a little bit of research, not a little bit, a lot, frankly, of research I've done. But again, you would have to get counsel specifically concerning your circumstance. But instead of pursuing the court martial route, a better option may be to simply request a religious accommodation under, and if you're listening, you may want to get a pin out, under DODI 1300.17. I'll do that again. Under DODI 1300.17. Under that provision, any military service member has the right to request a religious accommodation from any regulation, any policy, any directive, any order, etc. A religious accommodation does not challenge the lawfulness of an order, but it seeks to render the order inapplicable to the requester under certain circumstances. There is no requirement that a religious accommodation request include proof of the sincerity of the religious belief. All that is necessary is that a service member have a sincerely held religious belief that is substantially burdened by the order or directive at issue. So I wanted to make sure I got to that point in the conversation because, again, you do, as Jeremy said in the previous segment, as a military service member, there are lots of things you do give up. But one of the things that you do not give up is your right to religious freedom. So I wanted to share that. FirstLiberty.org has its vaccine religious liberty protection kit. You can get sample forms for filing your written religious accommodation request. Many of you may want to go there now. And if you have questions, there are a lot of resources available. First Liberty is a great resource if you have a particular situation that requires additional attention.
Stand up!